I never imagined that a simple day of fishing could spiral into something so dramatic. But when Margaret decided to claim ownership of Willow Lake, everything changed. It all started on a quiet morning, one that felt no different from the dozens before it. The air was crisp, the birds were singing, and the water was still perfect for fishing. I had been coming to this spot for years. It had become my little escape, a place where I could leave the world behind, forget about work, and just relax. But this time, as I set up my tackle box and cast my first line into the water, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The lake was still, but there was an unusual tension in the air. As I settled onto the worn-out dock, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. A woman was walking toward me, her silhouette slowly becoming clearer with each step. She wasn't a familiar face, and the way she carried herself immediately struck me as odd. She wasn't wearing fishing gear or even the kind of clothes you'd expect from someone who spent time near the lake. No, her heels were digging into the dirt with each step, sending dust into the air. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, like she was sizing up the situation from afar. I stood up instinctively, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. I didn't know who she was, but I could tell she was trouble. As she approached, I made a mental note of her demeanor, the tight-lipped smile, the air of superiority. She was the kind of woman who had likely never been told no in her life. She stopped a few feet away from me, her eyes scanning the surroundings as if she were inspecting a piece of property she owned. I watched, puzzled, as she took another step toward me, suddenly much closer. And then she spoke. Her voice was sharp, demanding, as though it was my duty to drop everything I was doing and listen. "This lake is mine," she said, her words hanging in the air like an accusation. At first, I thought it was a joke, some kind of misunderstanding. But as I looked at her, I saw the seriousness in her eyes. This wasn't some prank or friendly chat. This was a claim. "I'm sorry." "What?" I asked, unable to hide the confusion in my voice. "What do you mean? This lake is yours." She took a breath, clearly pleased that I was still standing there, confused and vulnerable. "I'm Margaret," she said, as if that was supposed to explain everything. "This lake is under my jurisdiction. I control all fishing rights here, and you'll need to pay a fee if you want to keep fishing." The words didn't even register at first. I blinked, hoping I hadn't heard her correctly. But then she handed me a document, a piece of paper that looked hastily thrown together, with strange seals and an illegible signature at the bottom. I took the document, feeling a growing sense of unease. The paper looked completely unofficial, as if someone had printed it off their home printer and slapped on a random stamp for effect. But Margaret was standing there, watching me expectantly, as if I should be impressed by her authority. "This is a legal document," she said, as if trying to reassure me. "It gives me the right to charge a fee for anyone fishing here." I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out more nervous than amused. This isn't real," I muttered, shaking my head. "This lake is public property. You can't just claim ownership of it. Who do you think you are?" My words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like Margaret was taken aback. But it was only for a split second before her face hardened again and her posture straightened. "Oh, you'd be surprised what I can do," she snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. "You think because you're some regular person, you can just do whatever you want? I've been here for years, making sure things run smoothly. You can pay the fee, or I'll call the authorities. They'll back me up." She smiled, as if she had just won the argument. But I wasn't backing down. This was my spot. This was the place I had come to for peace, for solitude, and now Margaret thought she could just come in and steal that away from me. I started to gather my things, shaking my head. I didn't know if I should call the police or simply walk away and find another fishing hole. But something told me that wasn't the end of it. I could feel it in my gut. Margaret wasn't just some local eccentric. She was dangerous in her entitlement, and she wasn't going to let this go. "You don't own this lake," I said, though my voice was much calmer than I felt. "And I'm not paying any fee. You have no right to charge anyone for this." Margaret's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, I wondered if she was going to make a scene. But she didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel, snapping her fingers as if I were some kind of dog she had commanded. "We'll see about that," she said, the smugness in her voice unmistakable. She walked away, her heels digging into the dirt with every step. But I knew she wasn't finished. Little did I know, this would be the beginning of a battle that would engulf the entire neighborhood. The escalation. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and frustration. I kept returning to the lake, expecting things to go back to normal, but Margaret's presence loomed over me like a dark cloud. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She had transformed into a figure of intimidation, someone who wasn't just making idle threats. Her actions became more aggressive with each passing day. At first, she would show up sporadically, standing at the edge of the lake, watching me like a hawk, as if daring me to ignore her rules. But soon, she began taking more drastic steps, attempting to impose her control over the whole area. She started going door to door, informing other residents that she was the new lake manager and that anyone found fishing would be fined. Some of the neighbors, scared by her confident demeanor and the documents she handed them, quietly complied. But something in me refused to back down. I knew I wasn't the only one affected by her delusions of grandeur. It was as though she had forgotten the basic concept of public spaces, believing she could claim ownership of something that wasn't hers to begin with. Still, I couldn't let it slide. I spoke to the other residents, trying to rally support, but they were too scared to take action. Margaret had already created a web of fear, manipulating everyone with her false sense of authority. It became clear that what she was doing wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger plan. She had become emboldened by the silence of those around her, assuming that her power was unchallenged. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't stand idly by while she destroyed everything that made the lake special. It wasn't just about fishing rights. It was about standing up for something bigger, for a community that had always valued freedom and fairness. But Margaret had already shown her hand. She wasn't going to stop with fishing fees. No, this was just the beginning. The turning point. As I sat by the lake, watching the still water shimmer in the late afternoon light, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was only a matter of time before she escalated things, before her next move would send everything spiraling out of control. And sure enough, it wasn't long before I saw her again, walking toward me with the same determined stride. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her was a man in a uniform, someone I didn't recognize. At first, I thought maybe it was just another one of her minions, someone she had recruited to enforce her fake lake laws. But as they approached, I could see the glint of a badge on the man's chest, and something about the way he stood made my stomach churn. He wasn't just an ordinary guy. He was playing the part of some kind of official, and I knew that this time, the situation had escalated to something much more serious. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my brow as Margaret's voice rang out, announcing that this officer was here to make sure I complied with the fishing rules. They weren't even trying to hide their intimidation tactics anymore. Margaret had now brought in someone who could potentially back up her claims with authority, and I was left with the unsettling feeling that the rules of the game had changed. This wasn't just a local dispute anymore. It had the potential to turn into something far uglier, something that would involve legal battles, law enforcement, and perhaps even my freedom. I had no idea who this officer was or how deeply involved Margaret had become in this twisted scheme, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let them win. They were pushing the boundaries of what was right, and I was determined to stop them before it went any further. The final confrontation. The tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. Margaret's false sense of power had pushed us all to the brink, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Her so-called security team had been patrolling the lake, making threats and intimidating anyone who dared approach the water. The very thought of someone taking control of something as simple as a lake, something that had always been a shared space for everyone, seemed impossible. Yet here we were, fighting over it as though it were a commodity to be controlled. Each day, the tension only grew as Margaret's grip on the situation tightened. But the truth was, she was losing ground. The people who had once kept quiet were now speaking out. They had come together in small, quiet meetings, collecting evidence of her actions and supporting one another as best they could. The more we documented Margaret's illegal activities, the clearer it became that she had no right to claim ownership of the lake or enforce rules that didn't exist. What Margaret failed to understand was that her power was built on lies, and those lies had begun to unravel. Her security team, which she had hired to intimidate and bully the residents, was nothing more than a group of people with no actual authority. They had no right to be there, no jurisdiction to enforce anything. And the more we learned, the more we realized how easily she had manipulated everyone into believing she was in control. But still, Margaret persisted. She became more desperate, using every resource she had to maintain the illusion of control. She began pulling out all the stops, even going as far as to contact law enforcement with fabricated reports about trespassing and harassment. Each time, the police showed up only to find that there was no evidence of any crime. Yet, Margaret didn't care. She was determined to make us believe that she was untouchable, that her false authority had somehow become an unshakable truth. It was frustrating to watch, but each time the truth was exposed, Margaret grew more agitated, more irrational. She couldn't accept the fact that people were starting to see her for who she truly was, a fraud. The fall of Margaret. The tipping point came unexpectedly one afternoon while Margaret was attempting to make another one of her ridiculous demands. The truth was finally brought to light in a way no one could ignore. Someone from the community had gotten hold of official records proving that Margaret had no legal claim over the lake or any right to charge fees. It was a blow to her that she couldn't recover from. The sense of invincibility she had built around herself started to shatter, piece by piece. People started confronting her in public, calling her out on the lies she had been spreading, and the tide began to turn. Margaret, who had once ruled the neighborhood with fear and deceit, was now being exposed for the fraud she truly was. The shift was palpable. The people who had once been afraid to speak up were now speaking out in force, no longer afraid of the consequences. And yet, as her walls crumbled, Margaret didn't back down. She dug in her heels, determined to fight to the bitter end. It became clear that this wasn't just about the lake anymore. It was about her ego, about her need to be in control, to have power over others. But what Margaret failed to realize was that power built on lies was always destined to fail. The cracks in her carefully constructed world were widening, and there was no way to stop the truth from flooding through. For every attempt she made to intimidate, for every letter she sent out, more and more people joined the fight. The community, once divided by fear, was now united by the shared goal of reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. It was no longer just about one person standing up for their rights. It was about a collective effort to stop a bully who had gone too far. The aftermath. The final confrontation was inevitable, and I could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The entire neighborhood was on edge, every resident either silently hoping for a resolution or actively fighting to expose the truth. Margaret, however, seemed completely blind to the growing wave against her. Her desperation had reached new heights as she clung to her delusions of power, making increasingly absurd claims about her authority over the lake. She even began making public announcements, as though she were some kind of official, telling anyone who would listen that the lake was hers, that people were trespassing, and that she would have them arrested if they didn't comply with her demands. The more she spoke, the more outrageous her claims became, and the more the community united against her. People stopped looking the other way. They stopped avoiding the lake, stopped staying quiet when she tried to dictate the rules. The tide had shifted completely. Yet, Margaret, refusing to admit defeat, continued to escalate the situation. She called in more people to patrol the lake, hiring a group of individuals who looked like they were straight out of a bad action movie. Their presence only served to highlight her desperation, and they were quickly seen for what they truly were, a group of hired hands with no actual legal authority. But despite the mounting evidence against her, Margaret refused to back down. It became clear that her goal wasn't to protect the lake. It was to maintain control, to feel the power that had eluded her for so long. But the walls were closing in, and she was running out of places to hide. The day of reckoning. The day of reckoning arrived with little warning, but once it came, it was impossible to ignore. Margaret had gone too far, and now she was being exposed for the fraud she truly was. The final piece of evidence came from a source no one expected, a whistleblower who had worked with Margaret and knew the full extent of her deception. This person came forward, revealing that Margaret had been forging official documents, using fake seals and signatures to give the illusion that she had ownership of the lake. The truth was finally out. The documents that had once seemed so official were nothing more than a web of lies she had carefully crafted to manipulate the community into believing she had power over the lake. But now that the truth had been uncovered, the authorities were forced to act. They moved swiftly, and it wasn't long before Margaret's fraudulent claims were officially debunked. What followed was a chain reaction. Margaret, who had once stood tall, arrogantly asserting her control, was now being publicly humiliated as the full extent of her lies came to light. The neighborhood that had once been divided by fear and uncertainty now stood united, victorious in the face of corruption and deceit. The lake was once again free for all to use, and Margaret's so-called ownership was exposed for the farce it had always been. The community, who had spent weeks living under the cloud of her manipulation, could finally breathe easy. And as for Margaret, the woman who had tried to seize control of something she had no right to claim, her downfall was swift and merciless. Legal action was taken against her for fraud and misrepresentation, and she was forced to answer for the damage she had caused. But the true victory wasn't just about winning in court. It was about standing up against an injustice that had threatened to tear the community apart. The final chapter of Margaret's reign was a cathartic release for all of us, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful they believed themselves to be, could ever succeed in the face of truth and unity. Epilogue: A New Beginning. In the days following Margaret's downfall, a strange calm settled over the neighborhood. The tension that had gripped us all for so long was finally gone, replaced by a collective sense of relief. The lake, once a battleground, was now a place of peace again. People returned to fishing, enjoying the serenity that had been taken from them for far too long. But what struck me the most was the shift in the community's dynamic. It wasn't just that Margaret had been exposed for the fraud she was. The very act of standing up to her had united us in a way I had never seen before. Neighbors who had once been strangers now exchanged friendly waves and shared stories of their own frustrations with Margaret's rule. We had all felt the weight of her control, but none of us had realized how much power we actually held together. It was a realization that stayed with me, that even when one person tries to impose their will on others, there's always strength in numbers. And for the first time in a long while, we were reminded of our collective power. As for Margaret, the consequences of her actions were swift and unforgiving. Her attempts to claim the lake as her own were met with legal repercussions, and she quickly found herself facing charges for fraud and harassment. What had once seemed like a petty power grab had spiraled into something much larger, and Margaret was forced to pay the price for her manipulation. Her reputation, built on lies, crumbled, and with it went her ability to control the community. She had tried to take something that didn't belong to her, something that was meant for everyone. And in the end, it was that very act that led to her undoing. For those of us who had stood up to her, the victory wasn't just about reclaiming the lake. It was about reclaiming our sense of justice, about proving that one person's desire for control couldn't defeat the power of the truth. The lake had always belonged to the community, and now, more than ever, we understood the importance of protecting it, of standing together against anyone who sought to take it from us. Looking back, I realized that what we had gone through wasn't just a battle for the lake. It was a battle for something much more profound: our right to live without fear, our right to live with dignity, and our right to protect what was rightfully ours. And as I watched the sun set over the calm waters of Willow Lake, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the peace that had been restored, but for the reminder that sometimes standing up for what's right requires more than just courage. It requires unity. In the end, it was the community that had won. And together, we would ensure that no one would ever try to take what was ours again.